Imagine a vast empire, full of jade palaces, rivers that wind between golden walls, and courts, where every word could mean power or death. It was 10th century China, an empire tired of wars, trying to rebuild itself after decades of chaos. In the midst of this scenario of transition and hope, a woman would emerge who would change the course of history, even without a crown, even without being born a noble woman. But before I tell you who she was, take a deep breath and take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, like it and comment if you've heard of the Song dynasty. This helps a lot to spread these stories that seem like they came out of a movie, but that really happened. Song dynasty arose from the ashes of a divided China. After nearly 50 years of instability, the so-called 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, General Zhao Kuang-yin crowned himself emperor and founded the Song dynasty in 968. He took the throne with a clear mission to unify the country, restore order, and consolidate imperial power once again. And truth be told, he succeeded, at least in part. But this new era did not begin smoothly. It was like trying to rebuild a city with the bricks still burning. The imperial court was beset by external threats, such as the Khitan empires to the north and the Tangut to the west, and also by internal suspicions. Generals still held too much power, ministers vied for influence, and the emperor had to tread carefully. In this tense climate, full of political upheaval, the women of the court also fought their own battles far from the battlefields, but within the walls of the Forbidden City. It was there, in the silk corridors and jade halls, that the story of a concubine would gain strength. She did not come from a powerful family, but she would become the centerpiece of one of the greatest secrets of the Chinese throne. And that's where Tai Fei comes in, a woman who knew how to use cunning, silence, and opportunity to infiltrate the heart of imperial politics. She appeared on this scene as if she had arrived quietly and slowly sat on the throne, even though she never officially wore the crown. Tai Fei was not born with titles or wealth. She did not come from one of the great families that controlled the destinies of the Chinese court. In fact, little is known about her childhood, which in itself says a lot, because at that time, if a woman was not from a noble family, her story was only recorded when she became interesting to the power. And that's exactly what happened. Tai Fei began her journey in the palace as a concubine, that is, one of the many women who lived to serve and, who knows, produce an heir for the emperor. But unlike others, she was not content with the role of an extra. She observed, listened, and above all, understood the court, the political games, the emperor's preferences, and who was falling from grace or rising in influence. It was like playing chess, but with human pieces. It didn't take long for her to catch the eye of Emperor Zhenzong, an intelligent man surrounded by ambitious ministers and wives who dreamed of power. Tai Fei, with her discreet posture and impeccable manners, stood out. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, but she conquered. The relationship between the two grew closer. And even though she was not the official empress, Tai Fei gained trust and space within the palace. And then came the moment that would change everything. The birth of the baby boy Zhao Zhen, who, although he was the son of another concubine of lower status, was given to Tai Fei to be raised as his own. She took the baby in her arms and silently began to write her story. She would become the woman who raised the future emperor of China. In the eyes of the world, she was the mother, and that detail, that silent lie, would sustain her power for decades. Tai Fei was not yet an empress. But what no one knew was that she was already beginning to behave like one. And when Emperor Zhenzong died, everything changed. Tai Fei would become something rare and dangerous, a woman who ruled in a man's world. Emperor Zhenzong was dead. The throne was empty. And there, in the heart of the Chinese Empire, the Forbidden City was quieter than ever. The eyes of the entire court turned to one boy, Zhao Zhen. The crown prince was still too young to understand the weight of the crown that would be placed on his head. But the boy was not alone. Beside him was Tai Fei, his mother in the eyes of the nation, though her blood told otherwise. Now, the fate of a gigantic empire was literally in her hands. Chinese tradition had a name for this type of situation: regency. When the new emperor was still too young to rule, a trusted person would assume power until he was old enough to reign. And so it was that Tai Fei, who did not yet have the official title of empress, came to rule China in effect. But anyone who thinks it was simple is mistaken. She was not crowned. She did not make speeches. She did not sit on the throne with pomp. On the contrary, she ruled from behind silk curtains, literally. That was how a woman could exercise power, behind screens, directing ministers, signing decrees in the name of her son emperor. But don't be fooled by this delicate description. Tai Fei was firm. She knew that if she showed weakness, her ministers would crush her like an unwanted shadow. So she surrounded herself with loyal allies, fended off those who threatened her, and kept the young emperor protected, both physically and politically. She did everything with extreme care. It was as if she were walking on broken glass. Every decision, every name given, every decree signed, everything was calculated to the millimeter. Because in ancient China, a woman in power was not just unusual, it was almost a scandal. But even so, Tai Fei stood firm. For years she ruled with stability, calmed internal disputes, protected borders, and ensured that the name of the Song dynasty remained strong. She may not wear the crown, but her rule was as regal as any emperor's. Young Zhao Zhen grew up, watching, learning, but there was a secret hidden beneath the silence of the palace. A secret that could crumble everything Tai Fei had built. For years, young Zhao Zhen believed in only one truth, that he was the son of the revered Tai Fei, the woman who had raised him, educated him, and ruled China as he grew up. In the eyes of the empire, she was his mother. In the eyes of history, a near-divine mentor. But the truth has a strange way of revealing itself, and when it does, it is rarely kind. The truth is that Zhao Zhen was not Tai Fei's son. In reality, he had been born to a low-ranking concubine, a woman with no influence or protection in the court. Soon after his birth, Tai Fei, realizing that this baby was the key to her future, took him for her own. It was not a kidnapping, it was a cold and calculated political move, silent but effective. She raised the boy with affection, but also with a purpose, to maintain her position at the top of the imperial hierarchy. And it worked. For years, no one dared to question it. It was easier and safer to accept that the legitimate heir was the son of the woman in charge. But time passes, and the boy became a man. Zhao Zhen, now crowned Emperor Renzong, began to hear whispers. Ancient documents, accounts from servants, strange memories, everything began to fit together like pieces of a forbidden puzzle, until he discovered the truth. The truth that Tai Fei had hidden for so long. Imagine the shock. The most powerful man in China, upon discovering that his mother was not his mother, that everything he believed about himself had been a construct, not just a personal lie, but a lie of state, maintained to protect the stability of an empire. And the most impressive, Renzong did not dethrone Tai Fei, did not punish her, did not exile her. Because deep down, no matter how much he had been deceived, he recognized everything she had done for him and for the empire, the pain of betrayal mixed with gratitude for her creation. A knot that was impossible to undo. It was a relationship marked by love, resentment, loyalty, and hurt. But this secret shook the foundations of the court. And it wasn't long before the ministers who had long viewed Tai Fei as a bothersome shadow began to take action. They knew the empire was about to change hands for good. Zhai was secret gen revealed. The relationship between Tai Fei and the imperial court became like walking on thin ice. Any misstep could shatter everything. The lie that had sustained the throne for decades was now public knowledge among the palace's top officials. And if there was one thing the ministers could not forgive, it was a woman in power for so long. Tai Fei had ruled with authority during the regency. He chose ministers, decided on military campaigns, and influenced tributes and decrees. Many powerful men had been removed or neutralized by his influence. And now, with the young emperor grown up and aware of the truth, these same men smelled opportunity. The court was divided. Fei's loyalists, younger officials, who had grown up under her protection and recognized her ability to keep the empire stable. On the other side were the conservatives, veterans of the Confucian bureaucracy, who had always seen her presence as an imbalance in the natural order, a woman who dared to command, to interfere, to reign without a throne. The intrigues began behind the scenes. Secret memos were sent to the emperor. Anonymous letters were circulated, accusing Tai Fei of manipulating the past, of abusing his power, of wanting to prolong his influence. Each word was a stab in the back. But Tai Fei was not naive. She knew the game. Even in the face of exhaustion, she did not retreat without a strategy. She knew that if she showed weakness, her enemies would crush her. So even as she grew older, she kept allies close by, strengthened bonds, and above all, tried to keep Emperor Renzong by her side, even though their relationship was strained by the pain of the revelation. The atmosphere in the palace was tense, almost suffocating. The imperial council meetings became minefields. A misplaced compliment, an ambiguous phrase, a memory from the past. Anything could be used against her. And little by little, the pieces began to move. The emperor, under pressure, would have to make a decision: keep Tai Fei close or let her be swallowed up by the wolves of the court. But before she disappeared from the political scene, she would leave a profound mark on the way female power was viewed in the empire. Even against all odds, she was still a force to be reckoned with. For years, Emperor Renzong lived under the sweetest of lies. To him, Tai Fei was more than just the woman who raised him. She was his mother, his beacon of hope, his link to childhood security. She guided him through the palace corridors, protected him from internal strife, and most importantly, held the reins of the empire as it grew. But then, everything changed. The truth arrived like a thick fog, which gradually took shape. First, there were small rumors, whispers among eunuchs, servants, and senior palace ladies. Then, forgotten documents, records that didn't match the official narrative. All of this slowly reached Renzong's ears, and as he began to connect the dots, a strange feeling came over him. Could his entire identity be built on a sham? The final blow came through a trusted advisor, who, pressured by Tai Fei's rival factions, revealed the truth. The emperor was not Tai Fei's son. His real mother had been a low-ranking concubine who had died forgotten while another woman took her place in history. Imagine the impact. Renzong was no ordinary emperor. He was a man deeply influenced by Confucianism, a doctrine that valued truth, hierarchy, and family morality. To discover that his own origins had been manipulated, and by the very people he loved most, was devastating. It was as if the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. But instead of reacting with immediate fury, he did something surprising. He cried. He cried in silence. According to ancient accounts, he cried not only for the betrayal, but for the loss of a story he had always believed to be real. He cried for the mother he had never known, and for the mother who had raised him with such care, even with such a heavy secret hidden in her chest. The court expected him to punish Tai Fei. Some ministers suggested removing her from the palace, publicly disgracing her, or even writing her off from history. But Renzong didn't do it. He chose forgiveness. A forgiveness that, though painful, showed the emotional complexity that only those who live between love and truth can understand. Tai Fei remained in the palace, weakened, yes, but respected. This revelation, however, changed the relationship between the two forever. The affection remained, but the trust was shaken. Renzong began to walk with more autonomy, and Tai Fei, although still influential, began to slowly retreat into the shadows of power. The truth can be liberating, but it can also be an invisible prison. And for the young Emperor Renzong, the revelation that his mother was not really his mother was like receiving a crown made of thorns. Even after confirming everything, that Tai Fei had not given birth to him, that his real mother had died in oblivion, that his childhood had been constructed on a carefully staged stage, he did not shout, did not order anyone to be arrested, did not punish anyone. On the contrary, he remained silent, but inside, he was in pieces. For days, Renzong spoke to almost no one. Court records speak of cancelled meetings, of an absent emperor. It is as if, for a time, he had ceased to be the ruler of an empire, and had returned to being that confused boy, lost among golden columns and shadows of the past. The pain wasn't just from the betrayal. It was the pain of emptiness, of doubt, of who am I, after all. And above all, there was something that gnawed at him even more. He could not tell anyone. This secret was not just his. To reveal it would mean casting mud on the name of Tai Fei, the woman who had, despite everything, loved him, raised him, guided him, and also tarnishing his own legitimacy as emperor. He would be the bastard son of a nameless concubine, not the perfect heir. This emotional conflict became a permanent shadow in Renzong's heart. He continued to treat Tai Fei with respect, but the tenderness was never the same. The smiling boy who had run around the palace gardens disappeared. In his place emerged a man who was more introspective, more suspicious, more cautious. The emperor's eyes changed. From then on, every decision he made carried an extra weight, an invisible layer of pain, and many scholars say that this emotional wound shaped Renzong's style of government. More sensitive, more peaceful, but also more solitary. It's incredible to think how a secret from the cradle could affect imperial decisions, diplomacy, wars avoided or fought, all because of a denied blood tie. Renzong's origins began to circulate, albeit in a subtle way. The palace was plunged into a state of hushed unease. The golden halls of the Forbidden City had seen many power plays before, but this secret in particular was different. Because it didn't affect just one person, it shook the very fabric of the Song dynasty. The court, always divided between progressives and conservatives, split into new fractures. On one side were those who saw the revelation as an opportunity to isolate Tai Fei once and for all. It was the perfect moment to remove her from politics, strip her of the last vestiges of influence, and rebalance power in the hands of traditional ministers. On the other side, however, were those who recognized all she had done and feared the chaos of a complete rupture. After all, Tai Fei had allies, she had history, she had respect even among her most bitter opponents. Most important, she still had the loyalty of many officers who had grown up under her rule. The empire was on a tightrope. Therefore, the watchword among the most experienced ministers was strategic silence. Yes, everyone knew the truth. Yes, the emperor knew it too. But no one wanted to be the first to bring it up openly, because touching that wound could mean provoking political instability, and no one wanted to be responsible for that. This silent pact created an atmosphere of contained tension. Court meetings became more formal, speeches became more calculated, and Tai Fei, even though he was still present behind the scenes, realized that his time as a central player in the political game was coming to an end. Yet she was not overthrown, nor dishonored. Fei's ability to maintain alliances, forge loyalties, and know when to retreat was crucial to averting an institutional crisis. She didn't need armies. Her presence, and the weight of what she represented, was enough to contain the attacks. But the climate was far from stable. Tensions were gathering like clouds before a storm, and the next phase of the story will show exactly how Tai Fei tried to maintain his influence without betraying the silence, and how the emperor began to finally take command of his own narrative. Fei's presence, even discreet, was still felt like a shadow cast over the throne. But time, always merciless, began to force changes that no one dared to rush. Emperor Renzong, now more mature and experienced, was no longer the obedient and hesitant young man he had been before. The pain of the revelation about his origins had transformed into something more dangerous: determination. He realized that if he wanted to be remembered as a true emperor, and not as a royal puppet, he would have to take control of his history. And that's exactly what he started doing. Without direct confrontation, without dishonoring Tai Fei, Renzong began to replace advisors, loyal to her, with ministers he trusted. Slowly, he changed the composition of the court. He began to make decisions independently, and gradually, the council meetings no longer had the influence of the Empress Dowager. Tai Fei, for her part, noticed the move, and like the strategist she always was, did not resist. She knew that prolonging her active presence could generate resentment and weaken the image of the emperor himself. And above all, she knew that her greatest legacy was not to maintain power, it was to ensure that the empire was in the hands of someone prepared to rule. This is how the transition took place without war, without scandal, without bloodshed. A true feat by the political standards of the time. Renzong took the reins of the empire firmly, but also with sensitivity. He inherited Tai Fei's taste for thoughtful decisions, but added his own vision, one that was more open to dialogue, more concerned with the well-being of the people, more committed to promoting internal reforms. This transition marked the beginning of a new cycle for the Song dynasty, a more peaceful, more administrative period, less dominated by palace intrigues, but not everything would be rosy. Because even after retreating, Tai Fei was still a living figure in the palace, and his name continued to circulate among the officials, among the people, among the documents of history, and as we will see below, his presence would continue to influence the empire. Even if silently, she no longer appeared at grand ceremonies. She no longer called meetings or signed decrees. Most of the nobles thought that Tai Fei had been silenced, but what many forgot is that silence is also a form of command. Even though she was no longer involved in direct political life, the former Empress Dowager continued to exert influence behind the scenes, not with shouts but with looks, not with orders but with memories, because every important minister of the time remembered who she was, and they knew that disrespecting Tai Fei was like spitting on the history of the dynasty itself. Some advisors still sought her opinion in secret. Others simply avoided making decisions that were directly contrary to what she would advocate. And Emperor Renzong himself, although autonomous, still carried within himself part of the worldview shaped by her. The most interesting, Tai Fei did not fight to maintain that influence. She let history do the work for her. Over time, people began to realize that the stability of the empire during Renzong's childhood, the policies of balance, the years of internal peace, and even the survival of the dynasty amid crises, bore her mark, not the mark of a decorative empress, but of a careful strategist who understood, like few others, the game of power in the Confucian world. Tai Fei began to be remembered with more respect, even by those who had previously criticized her. She became a symbol of feminine intelligence, quiet courage, and discreet diplomacy. Her image was transformed from that of a questioned regent to a historical icon. And when we talk about legacy, we are not just talking about politics. Tai Fei also left her mark on court culture, rituals, the way future consorts were trained, and the role of women within the palace. Even centuries later, scholars would look back on her career as an example of the power that can come from where you least expect it. But time is relentless, and with it would come the end of his journey. Time, which had once crowned her as the mother of the empire, now enveloped her with the inevitable cloak of old age. Tai Fei, the woman who had once been the center of decision-making, who had commanded with a firm gaze and thoughtful words, now walked slowly through the palace corridors, flanked by silent maids and memories that spoke louder than any voice. She no longer discussed politics. She no longer advised ministers. But she observed, she always observed. As the years passed, her figure became increasingly symbolic, a living legend within the imperial walls. Emperor Renzong, even after assuming full control of the government, never broke with her emotionally. They were no longer mother and son on paper, but the bond they had built endured. Renzong visited her chambers from time to time, not out of duty but out of reverence, and each visit was marked by long silences, meaningful glances, and sometimes discreet tears for a past that could not be changed. The end came peacefully, as if even death recognized the greatness of the one who was taking it. There was no commotion, no crises, no scandals. Tai Fei died in peace, inside the palace, surrounded by the few who were still part of her intimate life. The court then stopped. Days of mourning were declared, the colors of the empire were temporarily dimmed, and Renzong himself, the man who had become emperor under the shadow of a lie and grown up under its protection, wept like a son who had lost perhaps his last connection to childhood. But more than sadness, what remained was respect. Tai Fei was buried with full empress honors, even though she had never been officially crowned as such. It was the final recognition of her importance, not only as a political figure, but as a woman who redefined the role of women at the center of imperial power. And so, with his death, an era came to an end. An era marked by quiet diplomacy, discreet wisdom, and a behind-the-scenes mastery that history has rarely been able to recognize with justice. Fei's influence, that wouldn't be buried with her. For centuries, women's roles in imperial China were rigidly limited. They were expected to obey, serve, produce heirs, and remain silent. But with Tai Fei, that logic began to fray, albeit subtly. Fei's power was something else, that of constant influence, political intelligence, and the mastery of silence. What once seemed impossible, a woman without the title of empress making state decisions, became precedence. After his death, Court records began to be reread with a new light. Historians of the time began to recognize his role in stabilizing the transition between emperors, in maintaining peace during turbulent years, and especially in educating Renzong himself, who would come to be remembered as one of the most just emperors of the Song dynasty. But perhaps the most profound impact was on other women at court. After Tai Fei, more attention was paid to the role of imperial mothers, regents, and senior consort. Although Confucian structures remained firm, Tai Fei's example opened a crack in the walls of tradition. Women began to be consulted informally, more frequently. Their advice was noted, considered, and although few achieved her level of influence, the idea that a woman could rule by wisdom, not by imposition, took root. She became a reference in the training of princesses, consorts, and future empresses. Fei's figure has been retold in plays, poems, and chronicles, always as an example of powerful yin, the feminine energy that, even in silence, moves the pillars of the empire. The most ironic thing, the woman who lived part of her life under a lie was precisely the one who taught the court the value of a deeper truth. That power has no gender, but rather intelligence, courage, and vision. History, as you well know, advances, is not always kind to those who break the mold. And with Tai Fei, it was no different. As soon as she passed away, a silent dispute began. How would she be remembered? A veiled usurper or a savior of the throne? A fake mother or a real stateswoman? Song dynasty bureaucrats were cautious. They avoided strong adjectives. They acknowledged her importance, but did not overtly extol her. It was as if to say, yes, she was essential, but let's not exaggerate. But as the dynasties passed, new generations of historians began to reread the facts with more freedom. And that is when the image of Tai Fei took on much more complex and fascinating contours. Some chroniclers criticized her. Yes, they called her manipulative, a woman who hid behind the veil of motherhood to rule the empire without being crowned. They said that her prolonged regency disrespected Confucian norms, but many others, especially more modern ones, have revered her. They pointed out that Tai Fei was essential to the transition between two emperors, that she avoided internal wars, that she sustained the authority of the throne in delicate times, and what's more, that she managed to keep the court united without spilling a drop of blood. In an era where power struggles ended in executions and coups, this was extremely rare. Other historians, more sensitive to gender analysis, began to see her as a symbol of female power in a society that did everything to silence it. Tai Fei became the subject of studies in universities, academic theses, and even contemporary feminist debates, showing that her figure transcends the context of the Song dynasty. And the most interesting thing is this: she divided opinions, yes, but she was never ignored. Because one thing all scholars agree on, she was a real living and determining force in the history of imperial China. And if we are still talking about her today, it is because her name has withstood the test of time. And it has withstood not as a weak echo of the past, but as a presence that still pulsates. Have you ever stopped to think about how certain stories seem to echo through time, as if they were waiting for the right moment to teach us something? Tai Fei is one of those. In a male-dominated society, where strategy books were written for emperors and codes of conduct were designed to keep women silent, she did the unthinkable. She ruled. Without a title, without a crown, without formal legitimacy, but with intelligence, strategy, and a rare ability to read the board before the pieces even moved. And what does this tell us today? It tells us that power isn't always where the eye sees it. Sometimes it moves behind the scenes, in words spoken in whispers, in decisions made out of the spotlight. Tai Fei was proof that true influence doesn't need to be shouted at. It just needs presence and purpose. At a time when we are still fighting for representation in the spheres of power, Tai Fei's name reminds us that women have always been there. Maybe not in statues, maybe not in war manuals, but in the silent pulse that held kingdoms together, guided leaders, and often saved empires. From a political point of view, Tai Fei shows us that governing is not about dominating. It is about sustaining. It is about making decisions that are not always pleasing, but that maintain stability. She governed not out of ambition, but out of responsibility. And that is one of the most powerful lessons a ruler can teach. From a human point of view, It teaches about empathy. After all, even with all the wounds from the lies she lived, never took revenge on Renzong. He never used power to punish him, only to protect him. This is more than wisdom. It is greatness. And so, even after centuries, Tai Fei continues to provoke us to think, what does it mean to be a leader? Who deserves to be remembered? And how many women's stories have been erased, simply because they didn't fit the mold of traditional power? Time passes, empires fall, walls become ruins, and names are lost among parchments and dust. But some names, no. Some names defy the centuries. Tai Fei is one of those names. She has no marble statue in the gardens of Beijing. She has not been celebrated in gilded monuments or canonized in imperial cults. And yet, or perhaps for that very reason, her memory has survived. It has survived because it is not set in stone. It is set in examples, in academic debates, in plays, historical novels, and between the lines of classical texts. And now, look, it is also here, being told by me and by you, Edvan, to everyone who watches and shares this video. Tai Fei lives. It lives every time a woman is called weak for not occupying a throne, but shows that she understands power more than those who hold it. It lives when leadership is based on listening, wisdom, and construction, and not on authoritarianism. It lives when someone decides to do the right thing even if the whole world is looking the wrong way. And so, in the pantheon of the great names of history, alongside kings, generals, and emperors, there should be a place for her. A silent place, perhaps. Discreet, but firm, as she was. The story of Tai Fei is not just about imperial China. It is about us, about power, humanity, ambiguity, and about the courage to move forward even when the whole world doubts. So, if you've made it this far, friend, who is watching, tell me in the comments, what has left the biggest impression on you on this journey? Do you think Tai Fei's name should be remembered more in history classes? And of course, if this story kept you hooked until the end, like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, because there is still much more royalty, intrigue, glory, and downfalls for us to explore together. Until the next story, and may Tai Fei inspire us, always.